No one agrees on who fired first. Not the witnesses, not the newspapers, not even the men who survived it. In the American West, gunfights were supposed to be simple. One street, a few men, a clear beginning, a clear end. This one never had that. Depending on who you read, it involved 2 gunmen, or 4, or more. In some accounts, it lasted seconds. In others, it stretched on long enough for people to reload. Some say only 1 man died. Others insist multiple bodies were carried away. What everyone agrees on is that it happened. Everything else fractures. This gunfight entered history not because it was the deadliest or the largest or the most dramatic, but because it refused to settle into a single version. From the moment the shots were fired, the story began to change. And once it did, it never stopped. By the time it was written down, the truth was already competing with itself. The event took place in a frontier town that at the time was already unstable. Like many settlements in the late 19th century, it sat at the intersection of commerce, migration, and private power. Law existed, but enforcement depended on alliances. Order was present, but fragile. Violence was familiar. Gunfights were not rare, but they were usually personal. Disputes over land, money, loyalty. Most followed recognizable patterns. They began with an argument, escalated publicly, and ended quickly. This one did not. The confrontation reportedly began as a routine encounter. Men recognized each other. Words were exchanged. Witnesses later disagreed on what those words were, or whether they mattered at all. Some said the men were calm. Others claimed there was shouting. A few insisted no argument happened at all. Then the shooting started. What followed was chaos, but not the kind chaos explains. According to certain witnesses, only 2 men drew their weapons. Others described at least 4 guns being fired. Some placed the first shot near a saloon, others near a general store. A few insisted the first gunshot came from behind, unseen. The sound of gunfire echoed through the street, but the sequence is impossible to reconstruct cleanly. People ran, people froze, people watched, and later, when they spoke, their accounts diverged almost immediately. In one version, a single man fell. In another, 2 were hit. In another, someone was wounded but walked away and later disappeared from the record entirely. The bodies or body were removed quickly. Who moved them and where they were taken depends on which account is being told. This is where history usually steps in to clarify. In this case, it made things worse. Newspapers rushed to print their versions within hours or days, but they did not agree. Headlines contradicted each other. Names changed spelling. Roles shifted. In one paper, a man was described as the aggressor. In another, the same man was a victim. Editors relied on sources who were not neutral. Some witnesses had business interests. Some were aligned with local power structures. Some were directly connected to the men involved. Each account reflected more than memory. It reflected position. As days passed, the story did not converge. It splintered further. New details appeared. Old ones vanished. Motives were added retroactively. Certain actions were emphasized. Others quietly removed. The gunfight became less about what happened, and more about what needed to have happened. This is where the mystery deepens, because the inconsistencies are not random. They cluster. Accounts favorable to certain men describe restraint, self-defense, necessity. Versions unfavorable to them describe recklessness, ambush, or provocation. The same moment is framed as justified or criminal, depending on who is telling it and who benefits. Over time, one version begins to dominate, not because it is proven, but because it is repeated. The town settles on a story. Authorities reference it. Later historians inherit it. Contradictory accounts are footnoted, dismissed as confusion, or ignored entirely. The gunfight becomes fixed, but the cracks never disappear. If you read the original testimonies, they do not align in ways that can be explained by stress alone. The differences are too specific, too structured, too consistent within factions. This suggests something more deliberate than faulty memory. It suggests narrative shaping. In the Old West, memory was not just personal, it was political. Towns depended on reputations. Investors watched headlines. Lawmen answered to sponsors as much as statutes. A version of events that painted the town as orderly, the authorities as competent, and the violence as contained was valuable. Other versions were not, so they faded. Gunfights, especially public ones, threatened the illusion of control. Too much chaos implied weakness. Too much ambiguity implied failure. Simplifying violence made it manageable, and so the gunfight was edited, not once, but repeatedly. The problem is that the edits never fully aligned, which is why, more than a century later, historians still argue about basic facts. How many guns were drawn? Who fired first? Who was even present? Some of the men involved left town soon after. Others died under unrelated circumstances. A few changed their names. Some vanished from the record altogether. Their testimonies froze in time, never reconciled. What remains is not a single story, but a collision of them. And that collision tells us something important. When violence becomes inconvenient, history does not erase it. It corrects it. It smooths it. It aligns it. It chooses a version that allows the community to move on. But when the corrections fail to fully take hold, the result is something stranger than a legend. It is a wound that never closed. A gunfight that refuses to behave. And the closer you look at it, the clearer it becomes that the real mystery is not who fired first. It is why so many people needed the answer to be different. After years of conflicting testimony, the historical record eventually settled on a version of events. Not immediately, not unanimously, but firmly enough to endure. According to the accepted account, the gunfight was a result of a personal dispute that escalated in public. The men involved were already known to one another. Tensions had existed before that day, fueled by prior disagreements, rivalries, and unresolved accusations. The confrontation did not come out of nowhere. In this version, the encounter began when the two principal figures crossed paths on the main street. Words were exchanged. The argument grew heated. Witnesses later agreed that the situation deteriorated quickly, though not unpredictably. There was no ambush, no coordinated attack, no broader conspiracy. Just men, armed as most were in the Old West, allowing a dispute to turn violent. The official narrative emphasizes that the shooting was brief. One man, described as a primary aggressor, drew his weapon first. The other responded almost immediately. Shots were fired at close range. Nearby individuals either fled or sought cover. Within moments, the confrontation was over. The chaos in this telling was limited. According to this version, only a small number of firearms were discharged. Reports of multiple shooters were later attributed to confusion, echoing gunfire or misinterpretation by frightened bystanders. What initially sounded like a prolonged exchange was, in reality, a rapid sequence of events compressed by panic. The town did not descend into uncontrolled violence. Instead, order was restored quickly. In the accepted account, one man was fatally wounded and died shortly after. Another was injured but survived. The remaining participants either surrendered their weapons or left the immediate area without further incident. There was no running battle, no extended pursuit, no additional deaths. The gunfight, though shocking, was contained. Authorities arrived soon after. Statements were taken. The wounded were attended to. The dead were identified. Within days, a legal interpretation began to form, one that framed the event as an unfortunate but isolated outbreak of violence. Crucially, intent was addressed. The accepted version establishes that the man who fired first did so deliberately, but not without provocation. He is described as having acted recklessly, escalating a verbal dispute into a deadly encounter. The opposing party, meanwhile, is portrayed as reacting defensively, responding to an immediate threat. This distinction mattered. It allowed the violence to be categorized, judged, and filed. As the story stabilized, details were clarified. The number of shooters was reduced. The sequence of shots was simplified. The locations of those involved were fixed. What had initially appeared chaotic was reorganized into a linear progression. First the argument, then the draw, then the shots, then the casualties. This structure made the event legible. Newspaper accounts began to converge around this version. Later histories repeated it with confidence. Over time, it became the authoritative reconstruction, taught as fact rather than interpretation. In this telling, the gunfight serves a clear function. It is an example of frontier volatility, a reminder of how quickly disputes could turn deadly in a society where firearms were commonplace and authority unevenly enforced. But it is not treated as an anomaly. It fits within expectations. The violence is neither extraordinary nor inexplicable. It is framed as a consequence of human temperament and circumstance, not as a breakdown of the system itself. Importantly, the accepted narrative resolves responsibility. Blame is assigned. Actions are explained. Outcomes are justified. The town, according to this version, responded appropriately. Law enforcement acted when necessary. The legal system processed the aftermath. The incident, while tragic, did not expose deeper failures. And because of that, the story ends cleanly. The gunfight is remembered, but it does not linger. Its legacy is instructional rather than troubling. It reinforces existing beliefs about the Old West rather than challenging them. Violence is shown as dangerous but manageable, spontaneous but containable. This is a version that survived. It is the version that allows the event to be closed. The conflicting testimonies that preceded are treated as growing pains in the historical record, not as unresolved evidence. Early exaggerations are dismissed. Alternative accounts are sidelined. The final reconstruction is presented as the product of careful evaluation rather than selective memory. From this perspective, the mystery dissolves. There is no unanswered question about who fired first. No uncertainty about how many men were involved. No doubt about who died and why. The gunfight becomes a settled fact. And once it is settled, there is no longer reason to look at it too closely. Because in the official telling, everything that needed to be known is already known. The official version only works if you stop asking questions at the exact moment it becomes uncomfortable. Once you go past that point, it begins to collapse, not loudly, not all at once, but decisively. The first failure appears when the accepted sequence is compared to the original testimonies. In the official narrative, the gunfight is brief, contained, and linear. One aggressor, one response, one death, order restored. But the earliest accounts do not describe order. They describe confusion. Witnesses closest to the shooting could not agree on where the first shot came from. Some insisted it was fired from the left side of the street. Others placed it behind the men involved. A few claimed they heard gunfire before either of the supposed main participants drew their weapons. These are not small discrepancies. They are structural. If the first shot cannot be placed, then the entire question of aggression collapses with it. The second failure lies in the number of people involved. The official version reduces the event to two principal figures. Everyone else becomes background, observers, bystanders. That reduction is not supported by the earliest descriptions. Several accounts mention additional armed men positioned nearby. Some describe guns being raised that were never fired. Others describe shots that could not have come from the two men history later focused on. The official explanation dismisses these as panic-induced hallucinations. But panic does not invent consistent patterns, and the patterns repeat. The third failure is time. In the accepted narrative, the gunfight is over almost as soon as it begins. Seconds, moments, a contained eruption, but multiple witnesses describe a longer exchange. Enough time for people to run significant distances. Enough time for individuals to reload. Enough time for some participants to reposition themselves. This matters, because a prolonged exchange does not fit the idea of a spontaneous personal dispute. It suggests escalation, participation, opportunity for interference. The official version cannot accommodate that without unraveling, so it compresses time. Next comes the handling of the wounded and the dead. In the clean version, the casualties are immediately accounted for. The dead are identified. The injured are treated. Nothing is left unresolved. The original accounts do not agree. Some describe bodies being moved before authorities arrived. Others describe wounded men leaving the scene entirely, never to appear again in any legal or medical record. At least one individual reported as present during the gunfight disappears from documentation altogether after that day. No arrest record, no burial record, no explanation. History simply moves on without him. Then there's the behavior of the witnesses themselves. Several altered their statements over time, not in small ways, in ways that shifted responsibility. Change who appeared reckless and who appeared justified. These changes almost always moved in the same direction, toward order, toward clarity, toward legitimacy, never away from it. This is not how memory decays naturally. This is how stories are corrected. The deeper you examine the record, the clearer it becomes that the official version did not emerge because it was the most accurate. It emerged because it was the most useful. A contained gunfight reassures investors. A clear aggressor protects authorities. A short timeline minimizes failure. A resolved death prevents questions. The version history accepted did not explain the violence. It neutralized it. And that brings us to the most disturbing realization of all. The gunfight did not need to be remembered correctly. It only needed to be remembered safely. Once that goal was achieved, everything else became negotiable. Alternative accounts were labeled unreliable. Witnesses who complicated the story were sidelined. Contradictions were framed as noise rather than evidence. What survived was not the truth. It was the version that allowed the town, the law, and the historical record to move forward without admitting that something had gone deeply wrong. Because if the gunfight involved more men than acknowledged, then responsibility spreads. If the first shot cannot be identified, then justification collapses. If people vanished afterward, then the violence did not end where the story says it did. And if the event cannot be neatly explained, then the authority that claimed to explain it loses credibility. So the explanation hardened, and once it hardened, it stopped being examined. This is why, more than a century later, the gunfight still resists reconstruction, not because the evidence is gone, but because it was never allowed to exist in its full form. The mystery is not that people remembered differently. The mystery is that history chose one memory over all the others, and did so with confidence. When violence is inconvenient, it is not erased. It is rewritten until it behaves. The gunfight that everyone described differently did not become confusing by accident. It became confusing because the truth was more dangerous than the lie that replaced it. And that leaves us with a final problem. If this gunfight was corrected after the fact, how many others were? How many moments of frontier violence were simplified, contained, and resolved not because they were understood, but because they needed to be? History rarely tells us when it is choosing comfort over accuracy. It just closes the file and moves on. If this investigation made you question the version you were given, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It helps ensure these stories are examined instead of quietly corrected.